asked before in my life, and a question that often I kind of wonder about. When I was on the track to getting ordained, I was brought before the presbytery of the Missouri River Valley, and I stood in front of them, and they asked me that question, and they said, "Bryan, are you saved?" And I said, "I think so." That was not an answer they liked. They said, "Well, how can you think so?" Well, I said, I believe that I have been saved, but it's not mine to claim. You see, if I claimed my own salvation, then I wouldn't be claiming it for God, I would be claiming it for myself. For salvation is something that is claimed by God for us, not something that we attain by anything that we've done. I explained myself, and they still didn't like that answer. And I went into the theologians that had talked about it and said, well, your salvation is between you and God, and your salvation is what God has done for you, not what you have done for yourself. We went around and around and around like this for what seemed like hours. Actually, it was. Those were the days when pastors didn't have a whole lot of work to do, I guess. And they kept asking me the same things over and over again, as if I was going to change my mind. And I kept coming back and saying, but you have to understand, I don't believe that I can claim my own salvation. Because I believe that to claim my own salvation is to put my heart and my place in this world. Stand up and say, I have beat this world on my own belief, on my own feet. But I know that I haven't. You see, even though I believe wholeheartedly in God, and even though I am virtually sure of my salvation and my presence with God, I know that I am not perfect. And I know that I still sin. Not that I mean to or want to or seek it out, but I am human. And this is very important, because this is where we sit as people. I hate to break it to most human beings, but we are not gods. And we are not going to ascend to a place of godliness. We try very hard in our lives for perfection. We try to do everything right. But the fact of the matter is, we are not perfect. We are not God. We are people. People who try our best to do the right things. People who try our best to live into something different. When Paul is talking about this new reality of being a person born of the Spirit, this is the quality of life that he is talking about. He's asking the people who he is ministering to in this letter to look at themselves inwardly and ask themselves, what are you living for? Are you living for this world? Are you living for your salvation? Are you living for the things that you can attain? Or are you living for God? To this end, I often come back with some of my more conservative brethren and sistren to say, yeah, a concern about our salvation isn't the concern that we should have. The real concern that we should have is that question of how are we serving God and where is God in the midst of our lives? Looking at that question of where is God calling us to be and who is God calling us to be? Like many people this weekend, I watched the the play, the musical Hamilton on Disney Plus. Probably the most popular watched thing over the weekend. I'm sure many of you have seen it. It was interesting watching that, and I think I saw it about 2.5 times through in the time that I had, just to kind of pick up on it. And it was fascinating because as the main character, Hamilton, goes through, his concern is missing his opportunities. He is concerned about his place in the world. As a young person, you see him being concerned about having the right job, making a difference. The interesting thing about Hamilton is the reality of his life is that he made an incredible difference. Though there's also that part of him that didn't make the difference in the way that he hoped to make a difference. But does that lessen his story? Actually, the fact that he made a difference in a way beyond anything that he imagined makes his story so interesting and makes that message so powerful. For us, we often try to craft and to make things happen the way we want them to happen. But it's interesting. The more we try to force something, oftentimes the worse it comes out. And often when we step back from the earthly realm and pray about something, it's amazing how quickly things come back into order for us. Take, for example, this time. The first couple of months that we were in this COVID, we were running around like chickens with our heads cut off. Problem solving, figuring things out. But an interesting thing happened in that as well, because we had no framework to work from. We made it work. The question of how we did worship and how we got together in this time wasn't one of what we did correctly, but it was one of how do we be faithful to God by worshiping in a way that connects with people. Question of this world wasn't the driving force. The question of how were we respectful to God was. And I think that makes a big difference in how we went about things. And why we, as well as many other churches, have not seen a drastic decline in worship and activities of the congregation, even though they've moved online. Because the purpose of what we were doing was not to necessarily line our pockets or fill the pews or what all other things that might go before us are. Our goal was to ask ourselves, how are we serving God and where are we serving God and how can we serve God better? And it's amazing what happens with that. In a way, these last few months have been incredibly tiring for me, but at the same time, it has been one of the most powerful moments in my ministry. Because I've been able to meet people and hear people in very different ways. In fact, surprisingly enough for me, I actually have learned a lot. Learned a lot about the members of this church, and learned a lot about myself. But most importantly, I've learned a lot about God. Because without the trappings of everything else in the world, I've been able to focus on God. And I don't think that's something that we do enough, is focus on God. I think when we go through the rat race of our lives, we get so busy with everything else, we don't really give God time. For me, I know that my faith life has gotten deeper in prayer and meditation. Now, it's interesting to think about that because as I begin to also think about what's going to happen in 3 months or 6 months when this ends, how are things going to be different? Where are things going to be? And I have to say, I think that the church, not just our church, but the church in general, will be changed. I don't think any church you go back to will be the same as it was before. Because I think, at least for a short amount of time, people are going to see church differently. They're not going to come to church just to hear a lesson or to be challenged on this or that, but they're going to come to church because they need spiritual renewal. They need help in finding that connectedness to God. Because the one thing that Paul keeps telling us over and over again, the teaching that Jesus tells us over and over again, the teachings of the prophets in the Old Testament that they teach us over and over again, is that the true salvation for our lives comes from our relationship with God, our faith in God, and our trust in God. And when we have faith and trust in God, we don't need to worry about anything else. We don't need to worry about the things in this world. We don't need to worry about the things in the next. Because we know in our hearts where we lie. And we know where we are with God. I love the line from Paul's letter to the Romans where he says, if God is with us, who can be against us? And I think that is the crux of it. Because God is both our advocate, our counselor, our defender, and our judge. And that's an interesting place to be. Here we are, in the middle of a unique time, in a unique place, in a unique culture. And we look out into the world and we wonder, why? Why is all of this going on? And we see why. In America today, one of the great struggles we have right now is just that. We look at the mess that is before us, with rising COVID rates in communities that surround us, other states, and we see the pattern of why that's happening. In other places in the world, they realize the need to think beyond themselves and think of the greater good. But in America, no, we have to think about ourselves, our money, our power. And so what do? We choose to do things that don't make sense. We choose to follow our own desires, our own wants. And what does that do for us? But hurt our greater society. This is not something that is a form of communism or anything else. This is all about what it means to be a community and where we put our priorities, where we put our trust, where we can think beyond this moment where we can think beyond what we know and tap into the faith which is deep within us. Amen.